So, when we talk about immigrant integration in Europe, how do we actually know if it's working? It sounds like a simple question, right? But the answer has huge economic consequences. Today, we're going to dig into the data to find a story that's way more complicated than you might expect.
The usual way we do this is to just compare immigrants' economic outcomes, things like their income or employment rate, to the local population. If they're about the same, we tend to call that a success. But is that really telling us everything we need to know?
Think about it for a second. What if you have an immigrant group that's, on average, more educated than the native population, but they only manage to get the same economic results? Yeah, that doesn't really add up, does it? It suggests that there's something else going on, something hidden deep inside the numbers.
Okay, so if we're going to dig deeper, we first have to get on the same page about the starting point. How do researchers officially define what successful integration even looks like?
So, this is the textbook definition. It's all about closing those economic gaps. The idea is, when you can't see any real difference between an immigrant group's stats and the native populations, boom, integration achieved. But, like we just said, it's not always so cut and dry.
Right, and here's that twist I was talking about. Just picture an immigrant community where a ton of people have university degrees. Logically, you'd expect them to do better than the average person, not just the same. So if they're only just matching the native average, it tells us that some other force is holding them back. It reveals a kind of hidden barrier.
And that hidden barrier, well, it actually has a name. To really get what's going on in the data, we have to talk about a concept that researchers call the ethnic penalty. Let's break this down with a super simple example. Imagine we have two groups. Group A is highly educated. We're talking half of them have college degrees. Group B, on the other hand, has a much lower level of higher education. Now, common sense tells you Group A should be earning way more money, right? It's a no-brainer. But what if, when you look at the data, their incomes are exactly the same as Group B's? That difference between what should be happening and what is happening, that's the key.
And that unexplained gap, that thing that's left over when the numbers just don't add up, that is what researchers call the ethnic penalty. It's the disadvantage that's still there after you've already accounted for things like age and education. It's like a statistical fingerprint of all the invisible hurdles a group might be facing.
So, what's actually in this penalty? What are we talking about here? Well, it's really a catch-all for a bunch of real-world obstacles. It could be pointing to straight-up discrimination. Or maybe it's about not having the right social connections to find good jobs. Sometimes it's about employers just not valuing degrees from other countries. And for the first generation, of course, language skills can be a big part of it too. All right, now that we've got that idea of a penalty in our back pocket, let's actually apply it to the data. We'll start by looking at who's in the workforce and who isn't. Check this out. For first-generation women who've come from the Middle East and North Africa, nearly half of them are not in the paid workforce. They identify as homemakers. A lot of research links this to more traditional views on gender roles. But then, look what happens just one generation later. For their daughters, who were born and raised in Europe, that number gets cut almost in half, dropping down to 26%. That is a massive shift, and it shows a really powerful trend of adaptation from one generation to the next. Okay, now let's talk unemployment. I know this table looks like a lot, but just focus on the highlighted parts. What you see is that some groups, especially first-generation folks from the Middle East, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa, have much higher unemployment than you'd expect based on their education. And while things do get better for the second generation, you can see those penalties, those significant challenges are still there for many of those same communities. Let's just zoom in on one of those key groups to make it really clear. This chart tells the story perfectly. See how the unemployment rate for MENA Muslims goes down from the first generation to the second? That's definite progress. But you can also see that there's still a really big gap when you compare them to rooted Europeans. And, the data can throw some real curveballs. For instance, the research also found that in some countries, people who aren't religious, and that goes for both natives and immigrants, actually had a slightly higher risk of being unemployed than Christians did. It's just a little reminder that integration is shaped by a whole lot more than just where someone's family came from. Okay, so that covers employment. What about the other big piece of the economic puzzle? How much money people are making? And what you'll find is that a really similar pattern starts to emerge here. For the first generation, a lot of groups earn way less than the native population. But then, for the second generation, there's this huge jump forward. Look at how many groups move over to the left and completely close that gap. And yet, look at those highlighted groups.
A significant and unexplained income gap, that penalty we talked about, is still a problem for communities like MENA and South Asian Muslims, and for Caribbeans. So when it comes to income, there are really two stories happening at the same time. On the one hand, you have this clear and powerful economic progress. The kids of immigrants are, for the most part, earning a lot more than their parents did. But at the same time, for some specific communities, those hidden penalties, those income gaps that we can't explain away with education, are still a stubborn reality.
All right, so we've looked at who's working, who's not, and what people are earning. Let's zoom out. What's the bigger picture that all this data is trying to tell us?
So, what's the bottom line? Well, the data really points to two major things. First, there is absolutely undeniable upward mobility between the immigrant generations. That's a huge positive. But second, that progress isn't being shared equally. For certain communities, these persistent penalties in jobs and income suggest that integration just isn't a simple one-size-fits-all deal. The causes are really complex, pointing not just to discrimination, but to a whole web of social and cultural factors that are harder to pin down.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating question. It shows us that simply matching the success of the native population, well, that's not the whole story. The real story is in those gaps, the hidden penalties that the data lets us see but can't fully explain. It's like the statistics reveal the faint outline of these invisible barriers, and that forces us to ask a much tougher question. How do you even begin to fix a problem that you can only see as a shadow in the data?